Okay. We are recording. This will be on our YouTube page later, and some people are coming in, so let's give them a minute or two.
I plan to link to this later, so.
We will put that in the chat. Yes, indeedy.
Great.
Glad everyone's here. We're excited to have you. I even recognize some names, like my mom. Hi, Mom.
Oh, your mom's here.
Yeah. Hi, Joanne. Howie on
There we
here.
go.
Orlay. Valerie. Great to have you all.
All righty, Josh, why don't you go ahead and get started?
All right. Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's book discussion of Home Waters with author and naturalist David B. Williams. I'm Josh Knute, and I'm a part of the events team at the University Bookstore in Seattle, the oldest independent bookstore in the region. Tonight, Mr. Williams will be in discussion with writer and editor Knute Berger. So, David B. Williams is an author, naturalist, and tour guide whose new book, Home Waters, A Human and Natural History of Puget Sound, is a deep exploration of the stories of our beautiful waterway. He is also the author of the award-winning Too High and Too Steep, Reshaping Seattle's Topography, as well as the books Walks, Discovering History and Nature in Our City, and Stories in Stone, Travels Through Urban Geology. He is also a curatorial associate at the Burke Museum. He'll be in discussion with Knute Berger, who is Crosscut's editor at large and host of Mossback's Northwest TV series on KTS 9, as well as a regular commentator on KUOW-FM. He routinely writes about politics and regional heritage. He previously served as editor-in-chief of Seattle Weekly, editor and publisher of Eastside Week, and as managing editor of Washington Magazine. He is editor at large for Seattle Magazine and has written 2 books, Pugetopolis and Space Needle, The Spirit of Seattle. So links to Home Waters and any other books mentioned during the talk will be added to the chat. We'll be conducting a Q&A session at the end of the discussion, and we ask you to submit your questions in the Q&A field, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window. This event is being recorded and will be posted on our, our YouTube channel. So with all that out of the way, I would like to turn the floor over to David B. Williams and Knute Berger.
Thank you, Josh. I'm thrilled to be here talking with David, and we're going to get into conversation about his amazing book, Home Waters. But we're going to start with David is going to do a little reading, and then we'll dig into our conversation.
Great. It is a pleasure, Knute. Always wonderful to see you. It's so fun to be able to chat with you about this book, which you and I have been talking about really, I think, since the very beginning of this book, more than 5 years ago when I started work on it. And your discussions with you have always been fruitful and fun. So I'm honored to be here with you, and of course to be at the bookstore, one of the great institutions in our area. So as Knute said, I'm going to start with a little reading. It's about 5 minutes long, and it's from the beginning of the book. So if you'll just bear with me as I do this. In the summer of 2018, I grieved with millions of people around the world. Our collective sadness focused on the 21-year-old mother, Tlaaqua, one of a dwindling number of orca who regularly visit Puget Sound. On July 24th, Tlaaqua had given birth to her second child, a daughter who died within 30 minutes. For the next 17 days, she carried the 6-foot-long body of her dead offspring on a journey of more than 1,000 miles. Finally, Tlaaqua let her calf go. Our hearts broke. Then 2 years later, on September 6, 2020, it was with much joy that whale researchers announced Tlaaqua had given birth 2 days earlier. The healthy and precocious boy calf, dubbed J57, was born in the Strait of Juan de Fuca after an 18-month gestation. To paraphrase Emily Dickinson, hope is a baby orca in Puget Sound. Mourning the loss of a child is a natural response for humans and orca. Both species are smart, self-aware, and deeply connected to their families. Clearly, Talakwa, like us, had loved her daughter and did not want to part from her. And as we learned, her extended family tried to help by providing food for the grieving mother. Ecologists suggested that they might also have been mourning with her. Talakwa and her family are members of a group of more than 70 orca known as the southern resident killer whales. These animals, which evolved a culture and community unique to their home in Puget Sound, travel together, hunt together, and communicate using their own distinctive dialect. Solidifying their cultural affinity, the southern residents also rely on the collective knowledge of their elders, particularly the matriarchs, who act as guides and teachers to their family members. Why shouldn't they also love and grieve together? And why shouldn't we also love and grieve with Talakwa? Few animals are as sacred and iconic to Puget Sound's residents as orca, or in more dire straits. Habitat loss, disturbance from noise and boat traffic, exposure to an ever-increasing toxic mixture of pollutants, and overfishing of their favorite food have pushed the southern resident population to the point where their very survival in Puget Sound is in doubt. For many who followed Talakwa, their grief for her was compounded by their grief for the environment of Puget Sound and the way its degradation affects orcas and humans. If Talakwa and her calf couldn't thrive, what did it mean for us? More than any other story, Talakwa's loss crystallized the central environmental challenges of Puget Sound. The orca are suffering, the salmon are suffering, we are responsible. For most of my life, I've lived within a few miles of Puget Sound. I knew that I lived by troubled waters, but I did not fully grasp the magnitude of the crisis that had been rising around me, like the tide submerging a low island. Although I saw myself as someone deeply aware of my natural surroundings, I realized I simply hadn't paid close enough attention to a place I love and where I intend to reside for the rest of my life. I needed to take heed of all the people who have lived here, how they related to the landscape over the millennia, and how their stories could provide a better understanding of the conditions now shaping the lives of modern residents. Furthermore, as a writer who is generally focused on stories about the land, I had not fully appreciated the water and those who dwell in it. Standing on the shoreline or riding a ferry and seeing only the surface of the water, which tends to appear untainted and beautiful, I'd long failed to see the interconnected lives of the plants and animals beneath, and to understand how they sustain and breathe life, both metaphorically and literally, into Puget Sound. The effects of human activity reach deep beneath the surface. Our actions, their lives, our lives. We cannot cut one strand without unraveling the many connections that link us. This book then is my way to rectify my lack of understanding of the cultural and ecological history of my home waters and to provide a resource for others. The more of us who know and care about this place, the more momentum we can build to change our ways. We have reached a critical confluence for the waters of Puget Sound. Paraphrasing Wallace Stegner, is this a native home of hope where we can create a society to match its scenery, or will we succumb to baser values? Since I began writing Home Waters, my own enhanced appreciation and understanding of Puget Sound's incredible diversity, beauty, and potential for recovery have led me to believe that the most valuable assets of Puget Sound are not the resources we have long extracted, but the relationships that residents can make with this place. Learning from the past is central to forging and nurturing these relationships and to creating a positive future for Puget Sound and all its inhabitants. By taking this journey, I feel I gained an extra dimension of sight. Now, when I look out over the surface of the Sound, I can see deep into its history and the peopling of the landscape, its residents' travels by canoe, steamer, and ferry, their endeavors to carve out a living, and their fears of invaders. I can see deep underwater to lush forests of exquisite beauty and complexity, to corpulent clams that can outlive people, and to fish whose annual spawning creates a spasm of desire attracting uncountable numbers. I can also see into a future where I have hope. If the residents of Puget Sound hold this place to be special and unique, as I think we do, then we will recognize our responsibilities, not only to this generation, but to the generations to come, human and more than human. Thank you.
Oh, that's really terrific. And it sort of really sets up our discussion. David, I mean, we've talked about the book in bits and pieces over time. We're used to getting together, usually in the U District, over lunch to talk local history and share ideas. The thing about your book that really struck me when I read it was how ignorant I was. You know, I mean, I've grown up here, lived here virtually all my life, spent a lot of time on Puget Sound, on the beaches. And I was just astounded at the fact that you describe, and I think this is your geologist background, you described kind of what Puget Sound is and how it came to be and how it works. I mean, this was fascinating to me about what's under the water in terms of how water flows and the parts of the sound aren't all the same and that kind of thing. And I wonder if you could tell us more about, just kind of give us some definition of Puget Sound in terms of where does it begin? What are some of those dynamics, the physical dynamics that make it so unique, that make it a distinct place?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. And I think I was the same way. I mean, and as I said, that was really one of the things, like you, I've grown up here, lived here for most of my life, and thought I had a feeling for this place and realized how much more I needed to know and understand. And when I first started work on the book, I spent about 5 months chatting with people such as yourself, biologists, tribal members, to try and understand what were the stories of this place that needed to be told. And one of the first issues was, what is Puget Sound? What is this physical place? And there's many definitions, and I sort of think of two definitions. There's what I think of as Greater Puget Sound, and this is really the state's definition, and that's the idea that all the water that flows into Puget Sound is part of Puget Sound. So Puget Sound is a watershed. So from out to Cape Flattery, out on the coast, up to the top of Rainier, anything that lands in that area and on land, and then what precipitation ends up in the sound. And that to me is a very important definition because it acknowledges very strongly this idea that what we do on land, what happens on the land, what happens on the rivers, what happens to the fresh water, ultimately will affect what happens to the salt water of Puget Sound. And then there's what I think of as Puget Sound proper, and that's really the area south of Admiralty Inlet. So that area between Port Townsend and Whidbey Island, down all the way to Olympia and a little bit further south. And that name is relatively new. It's the name that arrived in 1792 with George Vancouver, who names it for his lieutenant, Peter Puget, who had explored the area south. Basically, the ship, Vancouver's ship, was anchored off of Bainbridge Island, and he sends Puget south. They explore, he and other people explore for about a week, come back, and then Vancouver says, to honor his exertions, I name it Puget Sound. Well, of course, this is the new name. The oldest name we know comes from Lushootseed, which is the Wholge, the salt. And it's less of a geographic or a cartographic term, and it's more a relationship term. And I think that's a real fundamental change that occurs in naming. And to me, naming is very important to understand the landscape. So that was this idea that the people who lived along the saltwater, that was their world. That's how they saw themselves. They were connected to place through the salt. And those people who lived in the freshwater, they were not as good, not as high quality. In fact, an early ethnographer, this is always one of my favorite stories to tell, an early ethnographer came across people who said, oh, if you wanted to insult someone, that they had lower breeding, you'd say, oh, you're like that person from yonder, Issaquah. So I just love this idea between the salt and the fresh water. But then going deeper back into your sort of question too, and certainly from a geologic point of view, the Sound's relatively recent as a saltwater body. It's only about 16,000 years old, 17,000 years, 18,000 years ago. This massive sheet of ice comes out of Canada, plows between the Olympics and the Cascades, goes all the way down to a little bit past Olympia, then melts or retreats back to the north. And while it's here, in Seattle, what's now Seattle, is about 3,000 feet thick, or 5 space needles. And water flowing under that ice excavated deep into the sediments below to carve out Puget Sound. The ice was more of a shaper of the hill. So the topography of Seattle, that's ice formed. The Lake Washington, Puget Sound, more water form. But what one of the things that you get at is this idea of the different basins of the sound. And as that water flowed underneath the ice and carved down, it hit areas that were a little bit harder, and a ridge remained, or a sill in geologic terms. So there's a big sill in Admiralty Inlet. There's a sill at the entrance to Hood Canal. There's a sill down by the Tacoma Narrows. So as water flows across that, as the tide moves in and moves out, water gets circulated. And so each of these basins, Hood Canal acts very differently than the Central Basin, which acts very differently than the Whidbey Basin, which acts differently than the South Sound. And because of that, we have different, you have some benefits with this, in the sense that food, nutrients, and small animals sort of get recirculated, but you also have a detriment of pollutants getting recirculated too. So it's a very complex body. And to me, understanding that accounts for some of the stories that I tell later in the book. So that's a long way to answer your question, but you're used to me, so rambling on.
It's fascinating. And that one of the facts that I kind of took away from and this is in the beginning of the book, was you talk about this issue. We talk about different ways that humans have affected the sound. And one of those ways is by building seawalls. I mean, if you take the ferry to Bremerton, you're amazed at the number of homes that are on the water. And I think you described it as armoring. It's, armoring the shoreline. And you said that if all of those seawalls were put together end to end, it would basically run down the Washington and Oregon coast?
Right, yeah.
It's that many miles of these seawalls in this kind of complicated thing. And how has that affected the sound?
Yeah, the seawall, the armoring is really an interesting issue, and it starts fairly early on in the history of the sound. In particular, when, a classic example is if you ever take the railroad north, you go north along those bluffs, and you're on an artificial landscape there that's built, and so it alters how the bluffs function. And one of the functions of the bluffs it had done for thousands of years in the sound was to erode and provide sediment to the shore, which was very important for particularly our forage fish, for the herring and the surf smelt and the sand lance, that are basically sort of the basis of one of the bases of the food chain here. So by building the armoring the shores, we've really altered habitat of these small fish. We've also altered habitat for where salmon are, that move along the shoreline. We've altered where trees grow, because there's no longer, some of these areas get protected and you don't have tree growth. And so it's this artificial environment. And for many decades, they didn't really understand the challenges of armoring. But in the last handful of years, we've started to see a real fundamental change as entities, in particular, some city parks state city parks have started to take out armoring and replace it with a more natural shoreline, which in terms of sea level rise is great, because these natural shorelines evolved with fluctuation in mind. That's how shorelines work. They're used to tidal change. They're used to sea levels changing. And so by altering that, by armoring, we've reduced the resiliency. And so we're seeing more of them being taken out. There's actually just a report that was just published in the last few weeks showing that more armoring is being taken out now than is being emplaced in the sound. And that's a huge, huge change. And we're starting to see it on both sort of level of government agencies, but also homeowners starting to realize the importance of eliminating the armoring and working together to eliminate. And it's just, it's a win-win situation.
Well, one of the things that fascinated me was that you said that from that the aquaculture has been going on there before we started putting in salmon pens and that kind of things. And one of the forms, or the earliest form that we have to show this, is these walls that were built at the shoreline. There are barriers that were in order to create clam gardens. In other words, the native people were cultivating shellfish for their diet. And of course, we take this kind of thing for granted today, but this was happening, I think you said 3,500 plus thousand years ago.
Yeah.
And this is something that, we sort of, the settlers overlooked, the way that the landscape was shaped. But the clam gardens are a technology that is coming back, I think.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that, that's really an interesting point. And I think there are 2 points there. One, maybe 3. One is this idea that the indigenous people did not shape the landscape to suit their needs. And we see it in a variety of ways, particularly with things like clam gardens, where they build these very low walls along the shore line in very shallow sloped areas. And then as sediment sort of filled in behind there, these became areas where they would cultivate clams and they would move them around. And so that's one aspect of it. And we see this not only with aquaculture, but we see it with burning landscapes. They burn prairies to keep prairies open for camas and for oak. So that's, I think, one part of the story is the indigenous use of the land where they altered it. But that alteration, what the fundamental difference was, it was alteration based on responding to change and understanding the landscape and being both proactive but also reactive. When things changed, you change back and you alter and respond to the landscape based on hundreds, if not thousands of years of knowledge. So people have been, working the land and having that connection to it for since people have been here, and over time learned it to work with the land and the water, as opposed to, I think, in many cases, and work against it. And so it's been a fundamental change. And I think as you said, we're starting to see clam gardens. There's talk, the Suquamish tribe is looking at, the Swinomish tribe is looking at reintroducing clam gardens, which would just be really exciting to see. And again, it's something that's adapted to long-term change. So it may help with sea level rise because it's a technology that's adapted to that long-term change and is related directly to place based on that deep knowledge of place.
Yeah, that deep knowledge of place, seems so important, and these clam gardens, made life easier, but they also didn't damage the environment. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, they were, and they're also on a small scale. And even though I think we're often have this image that, one of the reasons we have so much change in this landscape is this vast numbers of people. But there's an interesting study that was done looking at the use of salmon in the archaeological record and showed this very consistent use of salmon for thousands of years. And the authors make the point is that the indigenous people, the Coast Salish people, were able to do this because of their understanding of the relationship that they had and that knowledge with place. And so if salmon if they noticed, there was maybe a couple of years that weren't good, they backed off. And so to be able to continue to harvest a species or a group of species for thousands of years is really unusual, that they did not damage it. And again, it's all based on that power of observation and that relationship. And I think that's, to me, one of the goals in the book was to be able to, I hope, write in a way to encourage people to be observers and pay attention to that natural world that's out there so that you understand some of these processes and you understand these relationships, and by developing those stronger connections to place.
I think you're
and
very,
that's always my hope.
yeah, I think you're very successful in doing that, which kind of leads me to, I was introduced to a lot of critters in your book, some of whom I'm very familiar with, and others that I wasn't. And you talk about the fact that when we think about Puget Sound, we think of orcas, we think of salmon, both of which you've mentioned, but there's a whole cast of species, both plant and animal, marine species that aren't, they might be known to fishermen or whatever, but they aren't part of our symbolic language when we talk about. I mean, one of those is rockfish. I was just utterly fascinated by this chapter about this fish that you say is incredibly important and resilient. Tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah, rockfish are a fish I knew nothing about. And getting back to your point at the very beginning, I mean, several of these species that I focus on in the book, kelp, herring, rockfish, I really knew nothing about, but I was lucky enough to spend time with passionate biologists who really were willing to share the story and share their passion. And that was another sort of thing I was trying to do in the book, was to be able to illustrate this amazing diversity of place. And rockfish really exemplify many parts of the stories for me. One is that there are 27 species of rockfish found in Puget Sound in a single genus, Sebastes, which means magnificent. Salmon, I think there's 6 or 7 in their genus. So just incredible diversity. And they range in size from about, a little water bottle up to about 3 feet. And they're beautiful fish. If you go to the aquarium, they have an amazing array of these rockfish, and you just can't miss them. And there's one that sort of has this Nike yellow swoosh and these brilliant colors. I mean, they're beautiful fish, and these long spines. But they also are a fish that really suffered because of overfishing. And it curiously gets back to the Bolt decision of in the early 70s, when George Bolt restored the rights of the treaties to the native people of this area, that they had the rights to 50% of the fish. And what happened is, it was primarily salmon, is that then state officials pushed people to start fishing for other fish than salmon, and rockfish was one of that group. And so people started fishing them really hard. The problem was, and this is another incredible part of the story of rockfish, is we didn't understand the biology of rockfish. And I think, and I know for myself, when I think of fish, I think of salmon. They're born up in their streams, and then they head out to sea, and they'll live for a few years out there, and then they come back 2, 4, 8 years, handful of years. Rockfish, on the other hand, are born live in the marine environment, and they can live for 50, 100, 150. The oldest rockfish known was 205 years old. Which is just astounding to think that a fish.
That's a local rockfish.
Yeah, this one happened to be up in Alaska, but the species has been seen in the Sound. Yeah, and the rockfish have a little ear bone, and just like a tree, they put on a new layer each year. And if you are really, really precise person, I might use the term anal, you can polish those ear bones and count the years. And so as rockfish are really have this sort of human quality. They take several decades to mature to the point where they can start producing, and they can do it for decades. Decades and decades. I mean, well into their hundreds, they can continue to produce. But because we didn't understand that, when fishers were being pushed to catch the fish, it just decimated the population. And so one of the things I like about the story of rockfish is one, all the crazy sort of biology that's incredible, the human story, but also because there's an aspect of rockfish that gives me hope. And this, I know you and I talked earlier about talking about hope. This is one of the things that gives me hope about Puget Sound, is that biologists are beginning and are understanding the life histories of the species here. And as we develop a better understanding of how these species live, we're developing better ways to manage. We don't manage rockfish anything like we used to. Unfortunately, 2 of the species are on the threatened and endangered species list, but it's just a totally new way to manage. And we're starting to see that as biologists understand many of the different species that I talk about in the Sound and many species that I don't talk about. So that to me is an aspect of hope that I drew from the research, was this better understanding leading to better management.
That's one of the good things about the book is the way we get to meet some of the researchers and sort of look over their shoulder with you as you're seeing them do their work, their analysis, what they're finding, what they're not finding, how things have changed. Now, I want to hop to a different species that doesn't belong here, which is recently the beluga whale, which is in Puget Sound. I think as we speak, at least it was last week. And this is a whale that was determined to have come from the Beaufort Sea, probably 1,500 miles away. It's only the second time a beluga whale has ever been seen in Puget Sound. 1940 was the last time. So it's I mean, no pun intended, a fluke, apparently.
We've been hanging out too much together.
Yeah, but what I wanted to ask you about is what do you think this indicates? Is this are different species often coming into the Sound and exploring, or is there a change going on due to climate change? Is this just an accident? What's your sense of how what we know now is maybe changing because of climate change or other environmental conditions?
I would say
more belugas.
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, I think you do get species that just move in here because it's a nice little off ramp from the open ocean. It's an attractive environment. We are seeing climate change issues. I mean, it's been argued that the reason we're seeing more jellies or jellyfish in the Sound is the warming waters. And things get cited here that, normally have a much more southern reach and then are coming up into this area. So yeah, we are definitely experiencing all of that change. And I think part of the story of the Sound is, yes, it's a unique place, but the stories that are told here really can be told in many places. How the environment is changing, what effect we are having on it, and that we're going to have to think about what does that mean for our relationship to this place. And I think the beluga it's always an interesting one when one animal comes and it becomes sort of a symbol of a whole story. And I always sort of struggle with that because we focus so much attention on a single animal and not looking at the bigger picture, and which is what you're sort of asking, is how do those relate to each other. And I think it's a sign for us just to be paying attention, to beware. I recently read a book that I'm sure you've read, Jim Lynch's The Highest Tide, just this fabulous book. And his hero, whose name is escaping me right now, he finds all these animals, these new animals that show up in the Sound that no one's seen. And his observation, people ask, what does it mean? It means pay attention. And I think that's the symbol of an animal like the beluga, is for us to pay attention to the natural world and what we're doing to it and how we're changing it and what we can do to try and do to create better conditions for all the life that's in the Sound.
Well, I mean, you talk about the warming waters, which been a particular problem for certain species, oysters, for example, plus ocean acidification and those kinds of things. But there are other creatures that can be harvested or can be cultivated. You had a great line in the book, eating gooey ducks helps save the planet. And now I'm an evergreener. Our mascot is the gooey duck. Our slogan, Omina Extaris, let it all hang out. I'm very, very familiar with the gooey duck. But apparently these are also interesting creatures, kind of like the rockfish, but also there's kind of an interesting story here about the environmental impact of harvesting, eating, shipping, etc. Gooey ducks. So could you tell us a little bit about the gooey duck, which is kind of iconic just because of its shape?
Yeah. I think the gooey duck chapter is actually, it's paired with Olympia oyster, as you know, and those, to me, I purposely chose as two very iconic and really central species of the Sound. The Olympia oyster represents a storyline that I think is very important, in that they're the native oyster that we have. Most people don't realize that Pacific oyster, or many people don't realize the Pacific oysters, the big ones, the sort of oystery looking oysters that are served in many restaurants and such in Seattle, are not our native oyster. They were introduced and have done a good job of being spread. And the Olympia oyster, our native one, which are smaller, about
The
some
little
dollar
ones.
size. What?
Yeah. Oh, the little ones. Yeah.
Yeah, the little ones. They are native, and unfortunately, they were the first really big commercial maritime food shipped out of the Sound, and they were much bigger than salmon in the early history. And there are rules on the territorial books of Washington focus specifically on oysters, and the reason that private individuals can own shoreland in Washington state is because of the oyster. And the idea to me of the oyster is that it represents the early history of the Sound as people came here to exploit it, whether it was oyster, herring, salmon, trees, you name it. Gooey duck, on the other hand, has a much different story. It's one of the few animals around that actually has a native name. Gooey duck, from the Lachute seed, meaning to dig deep. If you've ever tried to get one, you know exactly what I'm talking about, how hard they are to get. But they are also heavily managed. Now, they never have been a species that was really exploited. They're completely regulated, every aspect of them. And so to me, that's really the modern story of sort of species management. And in some ways, the modern story of the Sound, in that we've switched from being people who live here, and this is post-contact, people who exploited, to people who now see that stewardship and sustainability are key. And the gooey duck, what's interesting about them is originally we thought they were purely an intertidal organism, that you could only get them, when the tide was way out, and then you could dig down. But starting in the 60s, it was discovered that they are subtidal. So they go down as deep as you can get down to 300 feet deep below the surface of the water, down 300 foot deep, and dig down and get gooey duck all the way through there. So and they're probably the most abundant life form, at least larger life form in the Sound. I mean, hundreds of millions.
Really?
And what's interesting is that this huge harvest, it's very valuable. There's Craig Welsh has that wonderful book about the illegal hunting of gooey duck. And but the point is that it's now very regulated, and almost all the gooey duck that's harvested, something like 97, 98% of the gooey duck that's harvested in Puget Sound, ends up being shipped over to Asia. I was lucky enough to go out with Suquamish tribal gooey duck hunters, and the way they do it is boat goes out and divers go off, and that's sort of the classic Jacques Cousteau with the big helmet, and they've got hoses coming up, and they dive into the water. They get to about 60 foot deep water. Then they're finding the gooey duck, and they have a thing called a stinger, which is basically a water jet, jam it into the ground, loosen up the sediment, pull up the gooey duck, put it in a bag. They get their whatever they need to collect. And then that gooey duck, basically the next day is in China. And my point, your point about the observation is that, here we are, this culture that is feels so important to eat locally, but we don't eat our gooey duck. And if we ate our gooey duck, we would, they're sustainably harvested. There plenty of food in them, as we all know. They taste fine, but we ship them out. And so that to me is sort of an odd thing, that we have this animal that's sort of a perfect food source, and yet they all get shipped overseas.
So if we ate them here, we would save the carbon of shipping them to China or Japan.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm just gonna interrupt because my mom is on this, and she wrote that when I was a boy, I had a little stuffed gooey duck and had this song, this gooey duck song. So I to be kind, I will not sing it.
Oh, come on, sing it.
No, I have a horrible voice. No.
Well, say hello to your mom.
I will. Hi, Mom.
She's a wonderful historian in her own right. Another thing, this is a marine critter, not critter, but a plant. Talk to us a little bit about kelp and the importance of kelp.
Kelps, again, I would, an argument has been made that the longest relationship between people and a species in the Pacific Northwest is with kelp. And this idea is that when people started colonizing, moving over to the New World, or going from Asia over to what's now over to North America, one thought is that they came overland, the Ice Free Corridor, the Bering Strait, but the other is that they came down what's referred to as the Kelp Highway. And kelp is, there's, in Puget Sound, there's something, I think 19 or 20 species of kelp. And they grow in fairly shallow water, almost always attached to a rocky substrate. And there really are, you often hear the phrase the kelp forest, and that kelp forest is really equivalent to the terrestrial forest in the marine environment. Just it has a overstory of the tall kelps, the bull kelp, the giant kelp, and then it has this understory of many, many different species of smaller kelp. The idea is that when people were traveling over here, they would have traveled along the water, along the shoreline there, and been in this kelp highway that they came down the coast, and one of the off-ramps would have been Puget Sound. They would have come into Puget Sound 13, 14,000 years ago. And as they traveled along, there was tons of food. Kelp is incredibly important to the communities, to the maritime, to the marine community, because it's a nursery, it's a safe habitat, it's an oasis, it's an area where all sorts of animals spend time, from little invertebrates all the way up to orca. You've probably seen photos of orca draping themselves in the kelp. No one knows why, but they do. And then that record of relationship to people, to the Coast Salish, to the indigenous peoples, continued all the way up through the present. And so this is a plant that just has this incredible importance culturally and an incredible importance ecologically to the sound. And that, again, to me, it just exemplifies the stories that I was trying to tell, and why I focused on have part of the book that's very human and parts more natural history, because I think to understand a place, it really helps to look at it from both those points of view, to think about what is our relationship to place, what is our relationship to the species, but what are the species relationships to place as well. And that was what one of the themes I was trying to convey throughout the book.
Well, that sort of brings me to another question. You and I discussed this a little bit once, but I want someone to create somewhat of a picture for me of what Puget Sound was like before Vancouver. And what do we know? In other words, are there ways that we can kind of project into the past to see what the fish runs were like, or what the kelp forests were like, or it's the population of sea mammals. Were orcas here every day as opposed to just a couple times a year? Or do you, in doing your research, did you get a picture of what the past of the sound was like in terms of the life and feel of the place?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think for the marine mammals, we probably know less, because all that we can base it on is what's found in the archaeological record. And we certainly find evidence of a variety of animals being eaten through time. So we know that they were here. We know that, again, the importance of salmon and herring to the native people of this area, that clearly shows that there was an abundance, that they provide an essential food source. So we can get ideas back on that. But I really don't, I think it's almost beyond our imagination what sort of abundance there was in this place. And one can argue that it's incredibly depressing that we don't have anything like that abundance. But you can also, I've talked to people, I remember having a conversation with someone at the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, Betsy Peabody, and she made the point that I'm inspired by that abundance to try and work to make it better. And that to me was really a central story for me, is to find inspiration in that knowledge, to try and work back and try and understand better, because we all have this bias that we look at, and what we know now and then what we know in 10 years, that's how we base our sort of knowledge. But I think if we can look deeper back into that record and get some ideas of what we do know, particularly with fish, we have good ideas. Marine mammal, it's a lot tougher. I mean, you look at the seals and the sea lions, and we just don't know. We don't know what it was like, because we've never been here when it was anything natural, because the state has bounties on those animals from very early on because they affected the salmon population, therefore people killed them. And it wasn't until the Marine Mammal Act that we started to see them come back. Getting back to orca, I know we need to open it up to questions, so I'll just sort of end with this idea. We think of the southern residents, as I talked about at the very beginning, Tlaaqua, and are struggling, and yet we've had record sightings of the other orca, bigs or transients, as they used to be called, the mammal eaters. So there's such a complexity about this place, and that I think is a real issue, that we sometimes get too focused on just the salmon, just the orca, when if we can take this bigger view of this incredibly complex, incredibly beautiful, incredibly resilient landscape, and think about how can we be better members of that community. And I guess I'd like to think that that Home Waters offers some ways to think about those relationships and those connections and those stories to help us develop that being part of a community here.
Let me just sneak in one last question from me, and then we'll go to the moderator, who will ask the audience questions. And do you have a favorite place, and one that you won't ruin by telling us all, but do you have a favorite place that to you just captures all of these wonderful aspects of the sound that you?
I actually will. I will ruin it in one sense, because I actually write about it. To me, it's it's watching tidal change, being on a beach and seeing that world that's revealed. I mean, I talk about being at Discovery Park and watching the tide go out and the tide come back in, and to think, and this gets back to, again, I talked about at the very beginning in the reading, is we look at the surface and we see this blue, and yet over a 6 or 8 hour period, which I write about, that water goes out and this incredible world is revealed, and then it's covered up again. But I know it's there, and I know that I feel more connected seeing it and watching it, and at least having a glimpse of it. So to me, it's the shorelines. I just think are amazing.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you, David and Josh. I turn it over to you for the chat and questions that have come in.
All right, wonderful. Well, we have some questions for you. Let me see here where we start. Some good questions here. Taha writes that they've read your book and were surprised to learn about the fact that Pacific oysters were actually Japanese oysters and the long lives of rockfish. And on that note, was wondering, out of your research, what did you find the most surprising?
What was most surprising? I think it was, thank you for the question, Taha. Thank you for joining us. I think it's the diversity here that I had never seen. I mean, one of the highlights for me of the whole time working on the book was I got to go out with some Washington Fish and Wildlife biologists. When they do an annual survey along the bottom, they dredge a little bit, bring everything up, count it, and then put it back in. And just to think that the sound is 900 feet deep at its deepest, and average of 200 feet. So this incredible world that's out there. And I sort of keep coming back to this. I think it really is the diversity of species that is here on just this incredible range, from little things to big things, different types of fish, all these different habitats. And that I think was one of the main point. And the other aspect of it is how these species are superbly adapted to place. That the home waters that I write about is also the home waters of many species that have adapted over the thousands of years of being here to have lives that are that they're able to live, and that there's this resiliency built in because the sort of the DNA of this place runs in their veins. And that to me was astounding to learn and understand better.
All right, so I have a question from Orle, who is wondering about your research in canoes, and specifically wondering, were the war canoes of indigenous Puget Sounders equal or even superior to the northern tribes, or were the attackers superior?
Yeah, good question, Orle. Thanks for joining us too. The war canoes were really more of a northern tradition, particularly because they were more ocean going. Our canoes in the Sound were much smaller and more adapted to the quiet waters of the Sound. So that was one aspect of it. But it's interesting, I was talking to a member of the Muckleshoot tribe, and he said, because of those war canoes coming down in, and the whole interaction warfare, which is one of the chapters of the book, he said, we had to adapt and make our canoes better and faster because of that. I mean, that's sort of classic technology race. So yes.
All right, so I have a question from Jack, who wonders, could abundance of the past be approximated by what we have seen in Alaska early turn of the century pictures? For instance, 19th century salmon harvest, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the impression I have of these. I mean, we do have we do have accounts. We have some early accounts from people who were out exploring this area. So we have some records from that. And then, we also have stories that the tribal people and the Coast Salish people tell, and which relay that abundance and give us an impression of that. But yeah, I mean, I think looking at other areas would be similar, as I said, looking to the north.
All right, well, Valerie says you both provide fabulous history for all of us, and wondered how the two of you have met.
Do you remember how we met?
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't. I mean, somehow we sought each other out. Was it part of that writing group you were putting together?
It could have been, yeah. And I think I think one thing that's nice about that, and if it's from Valerie Bunn, I mean, I think one who's a great historian herself, is that there's a community of people here who are looking at history. And I think what's great is that community, it keeps expanding in directions outside of, let's put it straight, let's put it for people like Skip and Knute and myself, older white guys. And we're seeing much more diverse histories being told. And I think that just keeps adding to the complexity and the beauty and our understanding of this place. And the more we understand those diverse stories, the better off we are. So I feel very fortunate that we have this historian community that is taking these deep dives, and that people are always willing to share. It's, I think, a real strong point that, like, oh, did you know this or did you know that? Like, oh yeah, happy to send you these documents. It's a wonderful community of historians.
So I'm just going to say that we have a couple of questions left. If anybody would like to get a question in under the wire, now would be the time, but I do have a couple here. So Joanne asks for some help with terminology, Salish Sea versus Puget Sound.
Yeah, great question, Joanne. So Salish Sea is this term that's come about in the last 30 plus years. And the idea behind the Salish Sea is that what we think of as Puget Sound proper, the Strait of Juan de Fuca out to Cape Flattery, and then the Strait of Georgia up the inside passage of Vancouver Island, the east side of Vancouver Island, is all one body of water. It's all the Salish Sea, and that the artificial boundary we've created at the 49th parallel, and that sort of winds down, is really irrelevant. And it should be irrelevant, particularly from a biological point of view, that these species move back and forth. So I think it's a great way to understand the interconnections, the bigger story of this landscape. I ended up focusing on the Sound because I wanted a little bit tighter storyline to focus on, even though stories I have cross Puget Sound proper, cross the Canadian border. But I think the Salish Sea it's a great way to visualize this place, that it's one united body of water, even though, as Skip and I talked at the very beginning, there's some big differences in how water moves through that landscape that accounts for some really significant changes in how the world works for those places.
All right, and I have a final question here. Kelly writes that, David, your books have deeply enriched her experience and her relationship with her surroundings here in the Seattle area.
Thank you.
She would like to know what she can look forward to reading from you in the future.
Thank you for asking. Thank you for your kind words on that. Right now, I am working on finishing up a manuscript. Actually, I guess I finished it, about fossils in Washington State, co-authored with woman, Liz Nesbitt, who is a retired professor from the UW and invertebrate paleontologist. And we're hoping that will be out, I don't know, either late next year or early in 2023. And I'm also starting to do research on a potential book about climate change. I've heard something about this subject, and I'm trying to hop on the bandwagon because I think it's a new, exciting field. But now I'm looking at climate change in the Northwest, and how is it playing out on really grounded ways, of anything from thinking about how do cities deal with rainstorms that used to be a ½ inch and are now 2 inches, and how do we go hiking when it's smoky, and what's happening to our glaciers, really. But also, as I always try and do, thinking about ways to offer inspiration and hope. Because as a writer, that is really a central part of my mission, is to think about ways to do that.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you to both of you, and thanks to everyone for attending tonight's discussion and for supporting an independent bookstore. We hope to see you again soon. You'll be able to find links for Home Waters both in the chat and on our events page. We will be posting the video of this discussion on our YouTube page in a few days. So with that, I'd like to thank David B. Williams and Knute Berger for sharing this conversation with us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you. It's been fun as usual, and wishing everyone to be safe and well during this the season that is upon us.
All right, thank you.
All right.